Have you seen any starter homes for sale lately? Neither have I. Hello, and welcome to the Who Killed the Starter Home podcast. My name is Marina Rabina. I'm an architect and developer in New Jersey, working to bring starter homes back from the brink of extinction. On this podcast, we usually focus on housing policy, but today we're starting a special series of conversations with candidates running for New Jersey's 12th Congressional District. While our listeners outside of New Jersey may not care about this specific election, they may be fascinated to hear that we have 17 courageous people putting themselves in the spotlight and offering their vision and ideas for the future of their country. Housing issues inevitably come up, so we aren't straying too far off topic. Our first guest is Jay Vaingankar, the youngest of the candidates, bringing his Gen Z perspective to the race. After graduating from the University of Pennsylvania, Jay worked in the Biden administration. He shares how his perspective on politics has been influenced by growing up in a family of immigrants in a very diverse community in Mercer County. If elected to Congress, Jay plans to major in energy and climate, leveraging his experience implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, while minoring in immigration reform. In our conversation, he shares his thoughts on why the Democratic Party and the Biden administration had a difficult time getting credit for the work they were doing, and why he believes a new generation of leaders is needed to address modern challenges like AI, housing scarcity, and climate change. Please note that the views expressed by the candidate are his own and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of this podcast. Given the nature of these long-form interviews, we cannot independently fact-check every claim made during the conversation. We encourage listeners to research the candidate and issues as we approach the primary. We would like to hear what you think, or if you have any ideas for how to bring the starter homes back from the brink of extinction, send us a note at starterhomepodcast@gmail.com. And then, Jay, thank you so much for joining our podcast today. And very nice to meet you. It would be great if you could start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what made you run for Congress.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Marina, for having me. It's such an honor to be here. I'd love to share a little bit about myself and why I'm running. I'm so proud to be running in the community where I was born and raised. I'm 28 years old. I'm a White House and Department of Energy Biden official. Grew up here in Mercer County, in a town that speaks 63 different languages. And my Spanish actually is better than my Hindi. So I don't tell my parents, but I grew up in a community so diverse where the language you speak, the color of your skin, the neighborhood you grew up in often determines your destiny. And that got me really motivated to become a community organizer. And that campaign work, whether it was in my school district, fighting the school to prison pipeline, or on the campaign trail in high school and college, that campaign work brought me to getting appointed to the White House, where I worked on COVID operations for 2 years, and then at the Department of Energy, I worked on the largest clean energy investment in U.S. history, the Inflation Reduction Act. And we worked on really cool programs like the Low-Income Heat Energy Assistance Program, often referred to as LIHEAP. And even while I was in D.C., I came home on the weekends back to the community that raised me. I would take the Amtrak home on weekends. And over the past several years, I saw how folks my age, folks of all generations, are getting priced out of central New Jersey. I mean, here in our state, we have the highest percentage of young people still living with our parents. It is nearly half of young people, which is twice the national average. And I talk to folks all over the state that say, Jay, my grandkids are going to get raised in Texas or Florida because my children did everything right. They worked hard in school, they got good jobs, and they still can't afford to live in the communities they grew up in. And so, to me, there's a lot of people in the Democratic Party saying, yeah, we gotta get rid of Trump and we just gotta go back to normal. But my generation has never experienced normalcy in our politics. We were raised in the aftermath of 9/11, through forever wars, grew up through a recession, graduated in a pandemic, and now we're living in a cost of living crisis where most folks are struggling to afford their own housing. And even if you are lucky enough to be able to afford a home, then it's the energy costs, it's the healthcare premiums that are putting you over. And so I think it's time for a new generation in our politics, a generation that has acutely experienced these modern day challenges of housing scarcity, AI, climate change, to really make sure we're tackling the issues of our time. I'm the son of Indian immigrants who came to this country over 30 years ago, believing that in a land they had never seen before, that if you work hard and treat others with dignity, that no matter who you are, how you look, or how you worship, that you can make it. And that's a promise we make to the next generation, that if you work hard, you can be better off than your parents. And right now that promise is breaking because so many folks my age can't even afford a home. We're stuck in our parents' bedrooms. And this is our opportunity to make sure that a new generation actually changes the status quo here, that we don't have folks in Washington who simply profit from the status quo.
Wow, excellent introduction. And you brought up so many important issues that we're all struggling with here. And it's so interesting to hear your perspective on it because as an immigrant myself, I very much share your sense that this is the land of opportunity, and we all truly believe that if we work hard, we could achieve the American dream, right? Yeah. So to kind of I don't know if this is a fair question, but what makes you think that Congress is the right place to do this? Why not run for mayor of your town?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when the joy of being 28 years old is a lot of folks, you would think a lot of folks at first would say, hey kid, like you're a young man in a hurry. Who do you think you are? But what has been a really pleasant surprise, Marina, is the past few months of this campaign, I've talked to so many voters in this district that are my parents' age that are the loudest ones saying, hey, our generation, we were able to buy homes. We made it. We were lucky because we bought at a time that it was way easier to buy a house, whether it was a mortgage rate or just the housing supply was much more in tune to our generation. It's your guys' generation that is at risk of not achieving the American dream. So there's too many folks our age that are messing things up. You guys got to get in there. And so on the age perception, it's been so cool to see folks of all generations saying it is time that we get some younger folks into politics. I am the youngest person in this Democratic primary, yet I am also the person in this primary with the most federal experience. I spent 4 years working for President Biden, where we worked on COVID operations and implementing the largest clean energy investment in U.S. history. So, more than anyone, I've had a top secret security clearance. I've navigated the federal government in D.C. And the most important job of a member of Congress, Marina, is, it's important to, be a good cheerleader and rail against people like Pete Hegseth and Pam Bondi. It's, of course, super important. But the most important job is bringing home money back to our community. Our current Congresswoman, Bonnie Watson-Coleman, has been an incredible progressive icon, an amazing champion at this. She sits on appropriations, and she has been masterful at bringing home money to our community. And we need someone in Congress who isn't going to have to learn on day one how DC works, how the federal agencies work. You need folks who, if a Social Security check doesn't come, or a Veterans Affairs claim is not processed, or if there's a project that isn't getting taken care of, that you know which federal agency to call. You know who in the caucus you need to go to. And so as the person in this race with the most federal experience, I think that uniquely puts me in a position to be able to deliver for this community. And the last thing I'll say on this is that so many of the affordability issues we're facing in our state right now, whether it's our high energy costs or our lack of housing supply, so much of that is coming from Washington. because there's so many people in DC, whether it's current members, whether it's lobbyists, whether it's folks in the Trump administration, who have a vested interest in the status quo. They want there to be as little housing supply as possible. They want fossil fuels to continue to restrict clean energy supply. And we need to get a new generation in there that can actually focus on everyday people and not just the interests of our donors.
Super interesting. So let me see if I can understand. I actually am very surprised that you think that the problems, for example, the thing that I'm mostly familiar with is housing, because this is my area where I work. And I was at least under the impression that a lot of the issues that we're facing are not coming from the federal government. They're much more local issues. So it sounds like that's not your perception. Can you walk me through what is it that the federal government is doing or not doing?
Yeah.
In the, at least, I would know stuff about housing. So, and
Totally.
it's also very interesting that you said that our current Congresswoman was able to bring a lot of money back to New Jersey. But at the same time, you were saying that we have the highest rate of people living with their parents.
Right.
So what are we not doing?
Yeah. Well, look, I would love to talk about some of the federal side of why housing is too scarce in our state, right? There's, of course, leaders on the state and local level that want to make sure that we're building more housing and fixing the zoning reform, and there are much more experts who can talk about the Mount Laurel decision and the state level issues. But on the federal level, we have a party in power right now that has a deliberate and explicit interest in making sure there's as little housing as possible, right? And that's what I want to go to Washington to tackle. So I'll give a few examples, right? First of all, with the tariffs that Trump has unleashed, these tariffs on lumber, on steel, have made it so much more difficult for builders to actually come in and actually build new housing. And even if they can build new housing, those costs ultimately get distributed down to the home buyers or the renters. What we also have seen is relentless deportations, whether it's folks who are undocumented and have been living here a long time and have committed no other crimes, or folks on visas who are getting their visas revoked. That is decreasing our labor supply. And of course, the visa restrictions preventing new folks from being able to come into the country and achieve the American dream. That's also restricting our ability to build new housing as quickly as possible. What we also need on a national level is a national permitting reform, because so many of the permitting issues that we're facing, and I've worked in clean energy, we saw this firsthand with trying to build solar farms and wind plants, etc. But you're starting to see it with housing as well, which is that there are too many burdensome regulations that make it too difficult to actually build new housing. And I think that we're often given this either or perception that, like, environmental regulations, you have to go all in and then build very little housing, or you have to completely repeal everything and just build as much as possible without any regard for environmental regulation. But you've seen in California, and now you're starting to see on the federal level, there are real reforms you can do to environmental regulations, like the National Environmental Policy Act, often referred to as NEPA. To make sure that it's easier to actually permit new housing. Because the challenge, Marina, is that when regulations are too burdensome, when there are too many certain assessments you have to do, too much paperwork to fill out, that often benefits really wealthy lawyers and really wealthy real estate entities, real estate developers that can get through those really burdensome requirements. So those are some of the ideas we have on the federal level to make sure that we have a policy of abundance, that you want to build as much as possible there.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree with you more that extra barriers are constantly being created that somebody then has to climb over in order to build homes for people, which seems like such a simple idea. Mm-hmm. However, in my practice, both in California and New Jersey, I have yet to come across a single federal level regulation that would cause a problem. All the regulations are local, maximum state level. So I guess I'm going to disagree with you on the role of federal government. So I'm still kind of trying to understand what role the federal government could play. Mm. And then the other interesting thing, I wonder if it's sort of, I am super curious, especially on your energy infrastructure experience. I would love to hear more about that, because I think the energy infrastructure is a substantially larger issue, right? And there maybe you have experience with federal regulations. And I also think, to your point about tariffs, I have yet to see really impact of tariffs on lumber. That has not really been a concern. The concern is that you are waiting for your permit for 2 years, so you don't even know what's going to be, the lumber cost 2 years from now is of no consequence, really. But I am more worried about tariffs on the environmental projects, right? So maybe walk us through, because you would think, are there tariffs on things like solar panels or things? That would be interesting to hear your expertise on that.
Yeah. So in terms of the clean energy policy, one of the things we worked on was the investment tax credit, right? That if you put down a certain amount of money to build a solar farm or wind turbines, that you would get a percentage of it back in the form of a grant. So if you put down $1 million for a really large solar farm, you could get 30% of that cost back. And if you use American-made products, it goes up to 40%. If you build it in a low-income neighborhood, it could go up to 50%. And so that benefit was supposed to last all the way until 2032. What the Trump administration did at the behest of fossil fuel companies was they cut that runway all the way to 2027. And a lot of projects now that were set to be planned and built out over the next 5 to 10 years to tackle some of this data center demand, to tackle the high energy costs in our community, a lot of those projects are getting canceled. And a lot of that federal money that was going to benefit that clean energy investment has now been either given as tax cuts to billionaires, or it's being used to fund ICE. And so the crazy thing is that every time you see an ICE deportation, or you see a data center that comes in that is often taking away jobs from entry-level folks and jacking up your electricity costs, you're paying for that in the form of your utility bills. And so we want to make sure that we restore the investment tax credit and have way more clean energy investment. But to answer your question about tariffs, yeah, we're seeing tariffs on not just solar panels, but also wind turbine, the monopile steel that's used to actually build out those materials. And we're seeing restrictions on type of workers that can actually come in and help us build those materials. And so that's all increasing the cost there. So you're seeing a lack of federal investment, and then you're seeing upward cost pressure from the tariffs as well. And so that's been a huge challenge. And I hear you when it comes to the tariffs on lumber, that the real issue is ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the permitting reform. Like, obviously we want to repeal these politically motivated tariffs. One bill that I would encourage all your listeners to take a look at, because it just passed the House and we want to make sure it passes the Senate, is the Housing for the 21st Century Act. And I've just been reading for the past several days what they've been doing in markup, and it passed with 390 votes in the House. I mean, you can't even get a post office renaming to get that many votes. And there's so many grants that they're doing to fund more housing development, whether it's in rural areas or also urban areas, but to also make sure we're streamlining the National Environmental Policy Act for smaller scale construction, for rehabilitating old, dilapidated housing that needs to be reignited to be habitable again, and allowing certain types of housing assistance grants to be designated as special projects to make sure they can go through the NEPA compliance process faster. And so I fully agree with you that there are so many environmental review challenges where developers, where potential homeowners are waiting 2, 3, sometimes 5 years for a permit to come through. And I think both the state and the federal level have to work together to make sure that both their tiers of regulations are not delaying the ability to build new housing.
Yeah, that bill is extremely exciting on so many fronts, right? So slightly to go back to what you were saying earlier, it's very interesting that, especially when you were in Washington and working for the Biden administration to implement all of these environmental incentives, it's so interesting that these things take such a long time that even though they started during the Biden administration, there was no visible result. Mm-hmm. right? So that it felt like things were not happening, things were not, and there was no clear, maybe, story told or explanation. How do you think that should have been either made happening faster? Because what I have heard on the ground is that what you're saying is these projects require predictability.
Right.
If somebody wants to build a giant solar farm, they need to make sure that things are stable and somebody isn't going to pull the funding from under them, right? And what could we do at the federal level to make sure that, first of all, leaders who are enacting these things are getting credit? But also that these incentives and these things that we want to do actually deliver on the promise. What is your sense? How would one go about this?
Yeah, it's such a good point you bring up, Marina, about the 10-year runway. I mean, in order for a lot of climate investments to work correctly, like you said, you need that predictability. You need to be able to do a 10-year plan. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act was set to create, in the short term, hundreds of thousands of jobs, but in the 10-year runway, millions of jobs. But that required a lot of forward planning, and politics often doesn't work in 10-year cycles, right? It works in 2 to 4 year cycles. If we're lucky, in this past year, everything has worked in like a 2-week cycle. So that's always been a challenge. I think you especially saw this in the Biden administration, where when we would visit a local community to tout the benefits of a new project, we would find that the local electeds would benefit from the PR, but that wouldn't go all the way up to the White House's credit. I'll give an example. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, there was a bridge that was created that was reformed and repaired between Ohio and Kentucky, right? And so President Biden said, okay, let's do a bipartisan event with Mitch McConnell and Andy Beshear to say, hey, we've got all parties together, we all voted for this infrastructure bill. After they did the event in front of this bridge to highlight it, Andy Beshear's, Democrat Governor Andy Beshear's approval rating went up. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's poll numbers went up, and President Biden stayed flat. And what we found was that local electeds were getting the credit, as they were part of that effort too, but it wasn't going all the way up to the national level. And this is a challenge we've seen in the Democratic Party for the last several years, right? And one thing I always try to remind folks in my party is you hear a lot of people saying that Democrats always have the right ideas, they just don't have the right messaging. Democrats have to fix their messaging. And I look at progressive leaders around the country who have been tremendously effective at messaging, whether they're younger, they're better at social media, they're better at getting captured by the algorithms. So to me, the challenge isn't for Democrats necessarily to fix their messaging, it's to empower the right messengers, right? You need the right folks going to those communities, speaking about the way that things actually come to benefit on the ground. I was at a factory in Ohio, in Fairfield, Ohio, in October 2024 for the ribbon cutting for a critical minerals manufacturing facility. Basically, it helps make the metals that go into batteries for EVs, so we don't have to be dependent on China and very destructive mining efforts. This was in rural Ohio, and I was there the same week that Trump was spreading the hoax that Haitian immigrants are eating dogs, they're eating cats, etc. So I was in Ohio for this ribbon cutting, and I was meeting with Haitian American workers on one end of the factory, and then I was also seeing Republican elected officials showing up to the factory opening, and I was on the verge of saying, you didn't vote for this bill. What the hell are you doing here? But it was a reminder that this was my opportunity as like a young Democrat representing the administration, not in the partisan political sense, but trying to push forward a climate agenda here to say we're not going to be distracted by racist hoaxes and scandals. We're going to push forward and create a policy agenda and investments that benefit everyone, no matter who you are or where you look like, especially in the communities that have been left behind. And we started to see a little bit of this once we sent younger, more digital-minded, more social media-minded Democrats into communities. I mean, the fact that 70% of the IRA's investments went to red districts, where 30% went to blue districts. I mean, a huge part of that was not because we were being politically targeted. It was going to some of the most low-income rural communities that had been left behind by both parties over the last several decades. So this was a big part of fixing our messaging, which was making sure we're empowering the right people to go to communities and explain to folks that these clean energy policies are not woke, like hippie nonsense. It's actually going to create jobs and create national security no matter your background.
I haven't heard that described that way. That's super interesting. Well, and I think that we're kind of getting to this interesting point that you started to mention with the recent bill is bipartisanship.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? I mean, we know that Democrats were in control for a really long time. We now have the reverse. What is the role of bipartisanship?
Yeah, I've always been a believer that you can reach across the aisle when you have common ground. I think that one mistake that a lot of folks in the Democratic Party have made in an attempt to create consensus is they water down their views. They try to moderate who they are to appeal to this archetype of a swing voter. And what we have found, not just through political research, but just by actually being out in the community, is if you actually stick to your beliefs, you're authentic, you say what you actually want to do, more people will respect the fact that you are staying true to who you are than trying to morph yourself into the perfect version designed for a specific type of voter, right? And this is where we encourage people in politics to not be two-faced. You actually say what you believe in, and then you find the common ground there. And by us being unapologetic about the need for clean energy, unapologetic of the need for new housing, that message is starting to break through, including voters that are incredibly loyal to the Republican Party. I mean, it doesn't matter who you vote for. Your utility bills are going up, right? It doesn't matter your views on Trump versus Harris. Like, your kids probably can't afford to buy an $800,000 home in 2026. And so where we're finding common ground is not because we've suddenly changed our policies and now they're more friendly to Republicans. It's because we're getting better and better at messaging to people of all parties that this crisis is really bad. And I don't want us to take all the credit for it. The crisis has also just gotten worse. I mean, it's gotten so bad to the point where you kind of have to leave your political party jersey at the door when you have to come in here and say, yeah, everyone is being affected by higher energy prices and higher housing costs. So that's where I see a really good opportunity for bipartisanship.
Yeah, so am I hearing correctly that it's not so much about the messaging or morphing of the messages or morphing of the person, but it's more kind of roll up your sleeves and let's work together to fix an actual serious problem we're having?
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, because to me it's a personnel issue, right? It's actually putting the right people in office that can go out and do those things. Because, here in New Jersey's 12th district, here in Central Jersey, this is a very progressive district. I think almost all the candidates are generally going to agree on the broader policy goals, right? Most folks here in Central Jersey want to abolish ICE. They want to make sure we have universal health care. They want to make sure we're building a ton of new housing and clean energy. Of course, there's going to be disagreements and pockets on exactly how to do that. But I think the question in this election is who is going to be the best cheerleader and the best fighter who can operate in D.C. and actually deliver on those things. So that's where I think I'm the best candidate here, because I can actually deliver and have delivered on that kind of federal policy.
Well, speaking of federal policy, apart from helping New Jerseyans, I think of you being in Congress as you're representing us in Congress and making decisions on our behalf for the future of the entire country. So what are your priorities on the sort of larger scale?
Yeah. So in Congress, they always say, you got to pick a major and you got to pick a minor, like you're in college, right? So for me, I think I've highlighted it so many times, is that my major would be energy, right? And when I talk about bringing money back home, I think that comes in two parts, right? One is you're quite literally earmarking projects to come to Mercer County or Middlesex County, Somerset, or Union. But also you want to advocate for policies that would have a tremendously good effect on our community here. So I've talked a bit about restoring the investment tax credit, or repealing the tariffs that increase costs here. But there's also policies that directly affect our community, like we're seeing here with ICE. I've come out and said early on, as I've believed throughout my life, that there's no like tiny reforms that you should be making to ICE. You should be abolishing it, because even though I'm the youngest candidate in this race, even I am older than ICE. We can enforce our immigration laws without having masked men, a paramilitary force out in the streets. And there's too many people in the Democratic Party who are saying, oh, well, we should put some QR codes on there, or we should just give them a body camera or mark their van. But that's not representative of the views of this district, and that's not representative of the views of the country. I mean, we don't want to empower these mass paramilitary forces to have cameras that could be used to track protesters. And, if you're being assaulted or on the verge of being murdered, as we've seen two dozen times in the past year, you're not going to have the capacity to whip out your phone and take a photo of a QR code. And so representing this community is about taking the experiences that I've had and bringing them to Washington. The reason I'm so passionate about what's going on with ICE is not because I've just been paying attention the past year with Trump's mass deportation efforts. It's because I've lived this. I grew up in Hightstown, which made itself a sanctuary town in the early 2000s. And I grew up with DACA kids who said every day when I go home, I have this anxiety that my mom or dad might also not be there because they may have been taken away at work. I talk to parents who are U.S. citizens, like parents of color, every day in this district, who every morning put their child's birth certificate or passport card in their child's backpack just in case an ICE agent tries to stop them for their accent or their appearance. So this is something that our community here in Central Jersey has been living for decades. I think Trump has simply poured gasoline on an already existing fire. And so my personal experiences, the community that I've lived in, drive me to fight for those causes, not just because I want to bring money home, but because I want to represent this community well in Congress.
Do you feel beyond abolishing ICE, is there room for bigger immigration reform?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that a lot of the discussion here about ICE and blaming undocumented immigrants for housing scarcity, blaming undocumented immigrants for wage suppression, etc., these are all myths designed to distract from the broader debate, which is that we actually have to fix the legal immigration system in this country. And you've especially seen this, whether it's in immigrant communities or all around the country, which is the visa restrictions that we're seeing, the restrictions on H-1B, the repeals of temporary protected status for refugee communities in this country. All of these things are attempts to try and tire us out, anger us, and keep us in a constant state of frustration and panic, to distract from the fact that there is wide bipartisan consensus for codifying DACA. There is bipartisan consensus for creating a pathway to citizenship for folks who have lived here for a long time. I mean, we've seen documents leak from from the Chinese government that have said, if America figures out its immigration system, if they figure out how to attract the best talent by not having mountains of paperwork and making it so hard to immigrate, they will own the 21st century. I mean, this is something, you hear so many folks in our party and both parties talk about, being competitive against China, and we have a stack of policy ideas, fixing our immigration system, not sending international students home the minute they graduate, but actually giving them the opportunity to create jobs here and grow their own American dream. And we're not doing that because we have a party in Washington that knows they have the wrong economic ideas of trying to give all this money to the rich. So they have to keep us distracted by villainizing immigrants. And I think that if we can bring in a majority of Democrats that have actually lived these experiences from immigrant backgrounds or just lived these experiences in our own communities, then we can actually get common sense immigration reform done that ambitiously attracts the best folks in the world to come here and protects the folks that have been here for decades and are every bit as American as any of us. They might just not have the paperwork to prove it yet.
Yeah, I mean, again, as an immigrant, you're preaching to the choir, right? I can't agree with you more that I believe that the strength of this country is extremely deeply connected to the immigrants that came here. I am wondering, there were periods in our recent history where Democrats were in power and
Hmm.
no immigration
Yep.
um, changes were done. What do you think will be different this time?
That's a great question, and one of my favorite topics I've been talking about in this race because a lot of folks say, "Look, there's so many candidates in this race, Jay. It's a safe blue seat. It's probably going to be a Democrat no matter what. Who cares who gets elected when we should put all our focus on flipping the red to blue seats?" And of course, we want to make sure that we're defeating Tom Kaine, we're defeating Jeff Van Drew, and we're flipping the House. But we want to make sure that we once we win the House, that House majority is a pro-immigration reform majority that actually has the political capital to say, we're putting this on the floor. Speaker Jeffries, you actually need to put this on the floor because this is a priority across all the members. So this is where, to me, it matters. Of a 225 seat majority, like 200 of those seats are going to be safe blue seats, right? This is how gerrymandering has affected our country. We need that 200 folks to have progressive, ambitious ideals on how to fix our immigration system. And we've seen, Marina, bipartisan immigration deals on the floor. Right, there was the deal in 2024 to codify more protections for undocumented immigrants in exchange for some more border security. And Trump noticed that would actually solve a lot of the migrant crises that we're facing. And he told Republicans, you got to reject that bill because then we won't have anything to talk about on the campaign trail. So this is our opportunity to retake the House with a pro-immigration reform majority that puts pressure on Democratic leadership to say, we're putting this on the table, and with an actual chamber in Congress and with better messengers in the Democratic Party, we can actually put that pressure on Republicans as well to say, you got to come back to the table. And this goes back to what I was saying before. The way you get Republican voters to agree with Democratic priorities is you don't necessarily water down what you believe in to try and get them over to your side. You stand on principle and show the authenticity of what you believe in and how it affects all of us, no matter who you are or where you come from. That if you are a Republican who is super supportive of law enforcement, that if these ICE agents are going around murdering folks in our streets, that affects you, even if it's not a member of your family that's being murdered. And I think that you're starting to see that messaging break through because the majority of Americans are now opposed to the existence of ICE. That was not the case a year ago. This Democrats who are good at messaging have been able to message about this crisis and say, look, this is not a one-year issue for us. We've been seeing this for 2 decades. Come onto the team, be part of this coalition because this is going to affect all of us no matter who you are or what you look like.
Wow, super interesting. Very inspiring. Are there other, so we talked about energy, we talked about housing a little bit, we talked about immigration. Are there other sort of larger issues for you
Yeah,
that you think, so what was the major and what was the minor? Again, so you're going to major in energy
that's right.
and minor in immigration?
I think I would definitely want to take on a few minors here.
Oh, okay, okay.
So
Or is it double major in energy and immigration?
something like that, right?
Oh,
And
okay.
so,
Double majors of fair. We're good.
yeah. And I think that, so we talked about immigration, we talked about energy, we talked about housing. A big one we have not gotten a chance to talk about is healthcare reform.
Yes,
I'm
right.
a big supporter of Medicare for all because, when my mom was 8.5 months pregnant with me, she was working really long hours with 2 jobs. She was a daycare worker and a bank teller. She came to this country with a master's degree in biochemistry, and a lot of the labs didn't recognize her Indian schooling certificates, so she had to start from scratch. And my dad every morning would take a 6 a.m. train to New York City, and they didn't have parental leave, so they just had to save as much money as possible so they could be with me. And in those really long hours they were working, they could just barely afford their healthcare premiums. And that's why I've become a big supporter of Medicare for all, because for me, we have to take the profit motive out of health insurance, right? Your ability to get good health care should not be dependent on your ability to pay. And we've seen this model work in every other developed country in the world, that Medicare doesn't just cover people 65 and up, it covers people of all ages. So if that bill's put on the floor, I would sponsor it, I would support it. I think that's a great idea. We have to live in reality, which is that ideally we flip the House. Ideally, we flip the Senate. I know that's going to be a little bit tougher. And then in 2 years, we flip the White House. It's going to take time to build a Medicare for all majority. So I have a couple ideas on what we can do in the meantime to get closer to 100% universal coverage, even if we don't have that perfect bill yet. One of them is to create a public option. We need to have a public entity that can outcompete the private markets and put downward pressure on costs. Right now, you see a lot of conversations about restoring the Obamacare subsidies, which I support. I think that's a good Band-Aid. But all that's really doing at the end of the day is just lining the profits of insurance companies rather than actually putting real downward pressure on healthcare premium costs. So we need the public option as one thing there. But one thing that no one's really talking about, Marina, is the fact that when you're 26 years old, you get kicked off your parents' health insurance plan. But the underemployment rate for folks in their late 20s, early 30s is way too high in this country. And so one thing we could do to cover a lot of folks in that gap is increasing the age at which you get kicked off your parents' health insurance plan. And then there's so many other reforms that we can make that sound more in the weeds but have real impacts, which is requiring coverage for reproductive care, strengthening bills that ensure that women who are on the verge of a miscarriage get abortion care no matter whether they live in a red state or a blue state, and ensuring that requiring that insurance companies cover maternity care, reproductive rights care, disability care, gender affirming care, to just make sure that healthcare is affirmed as a human right in every way possible, even if we still have a private insurance market.
This may be too much in the weeds, but I have surprisingly found out that there's some limit on how many doctors we can graduate from our medical schools.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard about this, or is this just me misunderstanding something?
My understanding broadly is that there is a huge doctor shortage in this country, and one of the tremendous benefits we've seen from H-1B programs. H-1B is often stereotyped as like tech workers, but one thing that's so underrated about H-1B is that so many doctors from around the world, including India, where my family's from, are willing and able to go to rural communities that don't really have too many doctors, and they've built a life and built a career there because they're happy to move to a rural community and achieve their own American dream. And restrictions on H-1B from this Trump administration are contributing to that doctor shortage. And that's also increasing the cost of healthcare. And even if you can get healthcare, if your primary care physician is an hour away, that probably deters you from getting certain health ailments checked up. And this is when folks discover diseases that are much more progressed by the time they actually get to their doctor. So I think, to your point, yeah, the doctor shortage in this country is abysmal. And this connects us back to immigration reform, but also connects us back to, we need to make sure we're graduating more doctors, that medical school is affordable, that folks, even all the way back in high school, when they're taking bio classes and they're interested in becoming a doctor, that they can afford to go to college. I think every public college should be tuition free in this country. And we need to make sure that cost is never a barrier for someone willing to achieve their biggest dreams in the medical field or any field.
Well, you jumped straight to the education.
Sure.
So explain that again. So you would like to see all public colleges be free for everybody. So most of our colleges are state-owned, right? The public colleges, right? So I went to the University of California, for example, which is a state system, and it has a in-state tuition that, when I went there, was incredibly affordable. It's still, comparatively to out of state, is very affordable. So what are you thinking, that all colleges and universities, like four-year colleges like University of California, should be free for everybody?
Yeah, that's the gold standard that we want to set, because, and this was proposed by Pramila Jayapal and a handful of other progressives, called the College for All Act. And tuition in this country, especially in the private school market, but also in public schools, is just so high. It's been outpacing inflation. So we want to make sure that we're looking into the costs of these universities, making sure that there's not too much pay for administrators, that high-level executives in these massive private colleges are taking out loans for their own private practices and things like that. But one of the really cool aspects of the College for All Act is it ensures that the wealthy are paying their fair share and funding the tuition of these public colleges. President Obama saw this proposal in the late 2010s and came up with his own sort of watered down version of free community college for all, which I think is great. And I think that's a really good start. And I think that is proof that we're moving the needle. But ideally, we want to get to a point where the cost of school should not be a deterrent for anyone to be able to achieve those dreams there. And you've seen the needle push forward. Folks have said, well, I don't support tuition-free college, I support debt-free college. That still concedes that the cost of college is too high, that students are graduating with incredibly high sums of debt, even if they went to a public school, and so that there's still an issue to be solved there. So I think we've got to start bold and make sure that we're fighting for the College for All Act. But in the meantime, as we build that majority, similar to Medicare for All, we can take on piecemeal proposals on our path there, like free community college for all, debt-free college, canceling predatory student debt. Those are all programs that I would totally support.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a person of your generation, I'm very interested to hear your opinion. Do you think college is still worth it? I have kids who are going to be going to college 1 and 2 years. He's a junior at high school, and he's starting to wonder, like, am I sure? Should I go to college? Is it worth it? The amount of money that you would spend, if I took that money and started a business, would that be a better way to go? And as a parent who is, an immigrant parent who's a huge believer in education, I'm petrified at this. Like, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I'll first start by saying it is a totally valid question to ask, right? And I think part of
as a young 16-year-old, you start wondering, right?
Yeah. And I graduated college in 2016, about 10 years ago. And I grew up, I think, in the last generation where it was just a given that the entire years of your K through 12 were designed to prepare you for applying to a 4-year college or university. And if that wasn't your goal, you would at least go to community college. I think now we're experiencing a world where people get to make their own decisions, where they could go to vocational school, they can go get a trade, they could start a business, see how that works out, get it off the ground, and then go to college. That's the other conversation a lot of folks aren't having, which is that, do you have to go to college when you turn 18? Could you participate in a national service opportunity, start a business, do some work abroad, or at home in your own neighborhood, and then go to college when you're 20 or 21? And so I think it's a very valid question to ask. I graduated from a 4-year university, and to me, so much of the benefit of being at that school was not just what I learned in the classroom, but what I learned being on a campus surrounded by thousands of people my age, where we had the privilege to just worry about who we were meeting, spending time with, focusing on our homework, our classes. And I think there are so many ways to replicate that kind of environment. But there's just so many different paths now in that crucial era of your early adulthood, those first 4, 5, 6 years, that can determine the rest of your life.
And changes in education and changing in that young age lead me to a question about AI.
Sure.
Because it seems to sort of fit into that category that I read recently that a lot of kids in college don't actually go to classes, and they, submit stuff that was prepared by AI, and it's just incredibly sad if that is indeed what's happening.
Yeah.
What do you think, as a person who graduated from college right before that whole thing unfolded?
Yeah, I think that my exact age cohort is in such a unique position because we are old enough to remember dial-up and VCRs. We are just, I was 3.5 years old when 9/11 happened. It is like one of my earliest memories, right? Like I have those memories that are just more associated with millennials, but because I'm Gen Z, I'm also just barely young enough to have done school in a pandemic. I experienced the advent of the workforce with the growth of AI. To your point, I am just old enough where I was the last generation to graduate school without AI tools. And so I now am really experiencing the age gap here, where I'm seeing students who are depending almost entirely on AI to write their essays or read through large case studies for them and then give them a summary. And just candidly, it's scary, right? It's scary because as someone who spent time going through all the readings, writing things from scratch, we look at these tools and potentially see them as shortcuts that are so obvious that you're not actually developing the skills. And you've seen, not just in this like in the student generation right now, but you're seeing it with people my age and older, is we're all losing our attention spans because of our phones. We're all losing a bit of a cognitive ability if instead of brainstorming something, we just go straight to a generative AI tool. And we have some really difficult questions to answer these next 2 to 5 years, in some ways the next 2 to 5 months, given how fast AI is developing, as to what is the role of AI in our lives. Because the optimist in me thinks, okay, there were certain jobs that we were really worried about getting eliminated by technological advancement 30 years ago, like typewriters, mailroom attendants, etc. And it's good that now those jobs are so much more efficient and done by machinery, and the folks who would have been in those roles have now been able to develop other skills thanks to solid education programs. But the speed at which this is happening has woken up all of us to say, how do we ensure that everyone who's the age of 22 to 25 or 18 to 25 can find an entry-level job, and that if certain roles are going to get replaced by AI, what are they going to do in the meantime? What will that free up? Because I think we're accelerating toward a world in which so many human jobs are going to be done more efficiently by computers and machines. What does that mean for the average human experience? We don't want to see AI create two forms, like two stratas of classes, where you have the ownership class that benefits from all the growth of AI, and they're just sitting relaxed and they make all this money, and then you have a wage class that is just stuck, not able to advance because AI has taken all those opportunities. When I think of the benefits of AI, I think about how it can make an individual's life easier. I think about how it can detect cancer earlier, all the medical. I get scared when I think about how the negative effects could lose a whole generation's cognitive abilities and economic building opportunities. And I don't think it's an either or. And I think that this question of yours, Marina, like hits on a point that only my generation has really experienced this acutely. And we can't rely on folks who've never actually gone through this experience to lead us in Congress. We need people who actually use generative AI tools, who have just experienced the hurt and the poisoning of the algorithm on our attention spans, who've actually been through these experiences to be leading us in Congress.
I'm very excited to hear, what could be done. I don't have a good solution, but it's so refreshing to hear you talk about sort of thinking about it and trying to portray your lived experience. So I've asked people in kind of my network of friends to see if people have questions. And one question that I think is a kind of a good, interesting way. So first of all, maybe talk about kind of in summary, if there's anything that you would like to kind of have people remember. But
Sure.
also, I had somebody ask this really interesting question, so I'm going to ask.
Sure.
If, this field of candidates, we have, 17, 18, right?
Anytime you say the number, it increases by 1 or 2. So
Yeah, that which I find so exciting and so fascinating. So if you were to look at the field of candidates, and we clearly think you think you're the best candidate, we got that.
yeah.
Who would be your second best choice?
I'd have to see how the field actually pans out. We just had our first candidate forum this past Sunday. It was co-sponsored by CARE and M-Gage at the Muslim Center of Greater Princeton. It was a great opportunity. Most of the candidates showed up, not all. But that was really our first opportunity to really face the music. And you've seen sort of the chatter in the news the last few weeks, like, candidates are still reevaluating their positions, they're changing where they stand. So I think that these first candidate forums, I know we'll hopefully see each other in Princeton this Sunday for the PCDO candidate forum. That's when we're going to actually see where the candidates stand, right? And so I think that will really show what are people's experiences, what are people actually like when they have to face the music. And so I'm excited for that opportunity. And once we figure that out, I'll definitely have my
No,
leg.
no, 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 no. You can't wiggle out of it. No, you're not going to pick one?
No, I can't pick one. Not yet, at least, because it's just so early in the race, Barney. Now, like we haven't gotten to see the candidates, actually be out in the community explaining their position. So I want to be a well-informed voter, right? I want to make sure that I'm evaluating the folks who might represent us based on how they actually stand, not just on their press releases or their social media videos. And I would hope, Marina, that people hold me to the same standard, right? I want people to come to the candidate forums. I want people to come to our meet and greets, come to our events, and actually hear me on the cuff and ask me tough questions about domestic policy, foreign policy, etc. Because in a race of 18 candidates, I mean, this is so exciting. Like New Jersey finally has real democracy where anyone can run for office, and this is our chance for everyone to actually be accountable to the one group of people that actually decides elections, which are voters.
Yeah, well, this is the whole reason I send out invitations to all the candidates, because I was so excited to see this many candidates, but on the other hand, having just little snippets is really not enough
That's
of an
right.
ability to make a decision. So my hope is to have this series of conversations to let people really truly see what candidates are all about and what they care about and what makes them excited to wake up in the morning and go for this campaign, right?
Yeah, absolutely. To answer your broader question, Marina, about like what I would like for people to remember, it's that we're living in a time of crisis where I think too many people think that we can just go back to normal if we just if we just elect Democrats again. And to me, there is no return to normalcy because my generation has never experienced normalcy, right? Like I said before, we grew up in the aftermath of 9/11. We experienced forever wars. I was raised through a recession. I graduated school into a pandemic under Donald Trump. And now we're experiencing a cost of living crisis where really no one my age can afford to achieve the same American dream that our parents did. And with that generational struggle that we're facing, we need that new energy in our politics. And not just, folks who are newer and fresher to politics, but folks who actually know how the system works and therefore are willing to change it. And I've done that in Washington, D.C. I've done that implementing the largest clean energy investment in U.S. history. But when I was privileged enough to be appointed by the president to work in his White House, in his Department of Energy, I always took the train home on the weekends back to the community that raised me because I wanted to make sure that local officials, local leaders had access to those clean energy grants. And so creating that bridge between the Beltway and the local community and ensuring that people, no matter who you are, how old you are, or what you look like or how you worship, have the opportunity to achieve the American dream. We're going to need some new energy to do it, and I think that means it's time for a new generation. I think it's time for a candidate like me to deliver that message.
Thank you.
This was really fun, Marina. Thanks so much for having me.